Hi, this is Irv Chabot with the Dr. Vax channel, and today we're going to cover a topic that comes up very often in the comments on this channel. You've just bought a new printer, you download Cura, you go to set up your new printer, and there's no definition for your printer. There's no default profile for your printer. So what do? Do you select another printer that you think might be close and then you modify it? Do you create a new profile from scratch? Can you just import a printer profile from somewhere? We're going to cover all these topics today, so stay tuned and let's learn something together. Let's start with a little bit of background about Cura. Let's look at the screen together. Cura is an open source software product, a slicer, a program that converts a three-dimensional model into a series of layers that you can print on a 3D printer. The primary sponsor of Cura and the organization that does most of the work on it is Ultimaker. Ultimaker is a commercial manufacturer of mid-range 3D printers. They produce 3D printers that are used by professionals. They're used by some schools, by some universities, and they're definitely above the hobbyist range. So why do they offer Cura as an open source solution? Well, I would have to guess it's to get you hooked on Cura, so that when you're ready to step up from being a hobbyist from printing at home on a $200, $300, $400, $500 printer, and you're ready to spend thousands of dollars on a printer, you already know and trust Ultimaker. In order to use Cura, you go to their website, you click on download for free. You can find this by just Googling Cura. And if you want to be contacted or you want to be on their mailing list, please fill in this information. However, there is an option at the bottom that says I don't want to share any information. And then you can just click on download and download Cura to your computer. From that point, you need to install Cura in the standard way you would install it based on your operating system. Okay, now let's start up Cura for the first time and see how to proceed. I'm going to click on the Cura icon. This is version 4, the most recent version. They just released a beta of 4.1. And you'll see that because I've never used this before, it's immediately asking me what printer I'm going to be using. It defaults to the latest Ultimaker printers, but then there's an option for custom and an option for other. The first thing you should do is take a look at other and see if your printer is listed here. Now, the printers listed here, the definitions are created by the open source community. They're not necessarily created by Ultimaker. Ultimaker doesn't guarantee them, so to speak. This is public. This is community software. If the printer you're looking for is listed here, select it, and you're gold. You're ready to go. But as an example, I have an Ender 5. There is no Ender 5 here. However, I know that the Ender 5 shares most of the components with the rest of the Ender line. And therefore, I'm going to select an Ender 3. I'm going to label it 3/5 so I know what it's called. And then I'll show you how to modify it to match my printer. So I'm going to go ahead and add printer. So now I have a profile here, but it's not exactly for my printer because my printer is a bit bigger. So I'm going to click on the name of the printer, then click on Manage Printers. Then, if I have multiple printers listed here, if I want to work on a particular printer, I have to click on Activate. Then click on Machine Settings. And I need to change the height of my printer from 250 to 300 because the Ender 5 is larger. Now let's go over the rest of these settings just to get an idea. So this is the width, This is the depth. This is the height of your printer, your X, Y, and Z. If you're using a Delta style printer, you'd set this to elliptic. I do have a heated bed. Generally, it's only Delta style printers that have an origin at the center. I have to define what type of firmware I'm using. Marlin is going to match most of your printers. Then at the beginning of every print, I need to give my printer some instructions to do housekeeping. As an example, if I have an auto bed leveling system, I need to tell it to go through that routine. I probably want to extrude some filament in order to make sure that the nozzle is clear. So that's what the Start G code does. So you can see in this particular case, it issues a G28 that says go to the home position. It says reset the extruder so it thinks it's starting from point 0. Because when you extrude filament, there are two ways you can do it. You can do it in an absolute mode or relative mode. In absolute mode, you'd tell your extruder, I want you to extrude 2 millimeters of filament. In relative mode, you extrude from the current position. So if you'd already extruded 2 millimeters of filament and you want 2 more, you would say extrude to 4 millimeters. I'm then going to move my print head around. I'm going to draw a first line. That's to make sure my extruder is extruding filament, move it around, draw some more, and then reset. Likewise, at the end of my print, I can define what to do, such as move the print head back up away from the printed object so it's easier to get my printer off. And now we can click close. So now we've modified this printer to our characteristics. We can close it out. Okay, now let's assume you have a brand new printer and it's not listed anywhere in Cura, and you want to configure for that brand new printer. So let's take an example of what the steps you would do are. I'm going to click on the printer name here and click on Add Printer. But instead of selecting one here, I'm going to select Custom. Let's give it a name. And say Add Printer. Now the first thing we have to do is tell it the dimensions of our printer. Let's say this was the equivalent of the Monoprice Mini Delta or Delta Mini, which is a small Delta printer. So I know it has 120 millimeters Z height. It's a round print bed. Origin is at the center. It is a heated print bed. Now, this next section of Start G code, you're going to need to get from your manufacturer. Alternatively, leave this alone. This does very basic things the way it's configured. Primarily, what you're going to have to change is if your printer has auto bed leveling, you'll need to insert the proper G code commands for the auto bed leveling. Print head settings. Entry height is, however, important. And in general, you should set this to a large number. And the reason is, if you're printing multiple items on your print bed, some are very high, some are relatively low. Let's say you print the tall one. The gantry height is the height above the nozzle where there's other structural components of your printer. So you print this high, tall print object. Then you go to print this small one, and when you come across to print it, maybe a bar or a part of the print mechanism hits that tall object. So by setting it to a large number, you're basically saying, if you're going to print multiple objects independently, they have to really be relatively low and flat items. Now let's go to extrude. You have to set your nozzle size. 4 is standard. You have to set your filament size. This defaults to 2.85, which would not be right for most home-based printers. That should be 1.75. Now we can click on Finish. You'll see since I defined a Delta printer, it's showing up as round here. Now what settings in here do I need to look at? Well, the first is quality. I do not want to use a layer height of 1. Let's actually go to normal or draft. Okay. And these are relatively important. So the initial layer height, if you set this too high, you will at times have trouble with your print sticking to the first layer. So for some printers where you have trouble with adhesion to the bed, setting this to the same size or just slightly higher than your standard layer height is a good idea. Another setting you should look at is under materials. You have to make sure temperatures are set right for your printer. And then we get to the more complicated settings. Speed in 3D printing kills. If you go too fast, you won't adhere to the bed, your printer quality will stink. So if you're having difficulty, the first thing to try is reducing speed. In particular, initial layer speed is often half or less than half of the overall speed you want to print at. So I've often gone as low as 15 or 20 millimeters per second for this. Now let's talk about acceleration control and jerk control. The default values for these really are often set by your printer in the firmware, which means that if you don't have these checked, it's going to just use the values in your firmware, which is a good place to start because your print will probably work properly. Now let's look at this picture and understand what fine-tuning these values can do. In this diagram, I've highlighted the different speeds at which your printhead will move during the course of a print. The green line is the speed you'd like to have as your standard speed. Now you can vary that for the part of the print, for infill, for the outside walls, for the top, for the bottom layer. But you can't get to that speed instantaneously. When you're moving your printhead, it has to reach that speed. The rate at which it attempts to reach that speed is called acceleration. We're accelerating at 300 millimeters per second. The faster you ask your printer to accelerate, the more it'll bounce around on the table. And potentially, the less accurate and reliable your print will be. Likewise, when you come to the end of a movement and you're going to move the printhead for a travel or other activities, you have to stop. If you come to a hard stop, your print will bounce around again. So you want to ease that stop. How do you ease that stop? You start slowing down the print before the point you need to stop. That is the jerk control or jerk print setting. The default in Cura is 20 millimeters per second. Now in an acceleration control, the units are interesting. The default is 3,000 millimeters per second square. That means it can change the rate of acceleration by up to 3,000 millimeters per second over a second. Okay, let's go back to our settings, and I'd like to show you one setting that I find is very, very important. Combing mode is a very important parameter. It tells the printer that when it's going to move the printhead and it's not actively printing, it should try to move it over already printed areas, as opposed to moving it outside of the print. When you move it outside of the print, you potentially get stringing. Now, you'll get the same stringing when you're moving it over a print area, but potentially if you're printing on top of it later, you'll never see it. However, when you do that on the very top or the outside of your model, you end up seeing those strings as lines in that surface. So if you want perfect top layers and bottom layers, I recommend setting combing to an option for not in skin. So now we know you can set up Cura 3 different ways. You can select an existing printer and just use it. You can select an existing printer and modify it by clicking on Manage Printers. Remember, you have to activate a printer to be able to change the settings. And we've learned a little bit about setting up a printer from scratch. Well, I hope you learned something today. If this was helpful, give me a thumbs up. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you'll hear about future videos. Tell your friends about this. And most importantly, let's continue to learn things together.